when I first started working with Nelson Mandela after he came out of jail, I was a kid. I was in my 20s. And one of the first things he told me about was what he saw as the fraternal alliance between the South African struggle, the Palestinian struggle, and the Irish struggle. And it has always meant that for me, those three countries have remained at the center of my personal world and my political life. I just so wish that I could be there with you in person, and I apologize that I can't. A confluence of health issues and logistical reasons unfortunately made it impossible, but hopefully I will be soon. I think that what you've set out to do this weekend is incredibly important. And the question that I would ask as an outsider, and a real outsider from the southern tip of Africa, is why on earth would Ireland want to give up its proud neutrality and immerse itself in the belly of the beast that is the Western shadow world of militarism? Because what this world is not a world that brings greater safety, greater prosperity, a better life for all humanity. In fact, it is exactly the opposite. The trade in weapons, which is at the commercial heart of Western militarism, and which I fear and suspect Ireland wants to become a far greater player in, is the most horrific trade known to humankind. It is characterized by extreme levels of corruption and wastefulness, is terrible for our economies, and ensures without fail massive cuts to welfare spending, to spending on the climate catastrophe, to spending on health, on infrastructure, on education, and other social needs. In terms of corruption, the trade in weapons accounts on an average year for over 40% of all corruption in world trade. And what is crucial, absolutely crucial to be aware of in relation to that corruption, is when Imperial Britain does a massive arms deal with Saudi Arabia, or with the United Arab Emirates, or with Israel, it's not just that the bribes land up in the hands of the Saudi or Emirati royal family, or Benjamin Netanyahu and his close-knit family of advisors, most of whom are his cousins. But some of that corruption returns to Britain in the form of what we describe as the feedback principle, and finds its way into our political system. So on the most corrupt commercial transaction in history, the so-called Al-Yamama deal between Britain and Saudi Arabia, in which £6 billion of bribes were paid. Not only was the chief executive of BAE Systems given a flat by one of the arms dealers or intermediaries in central London in Mayfair that's probably worth around £30 million today, the son of the then Prime Minister, Mark Thatcher, was given £12 million. Why? Because his mother didn't want to continue to have to spend money on his wastrel son who couldn't earn a penny for himself. And this led some people to describe the deal as the Who's Your Mama deal. But most crucially, some of those bribes found their way into the Conservative Party. And of course, as soon as Tony Blair, who Thatcher described as her greatest political achievement because he turned the Labour Party into just another neoliberal, warmongering, corrupt party, as soon as Blair was in office, the same thing happened to him. Personally, since leaving office, Tony Blair has made in excess of £100 million out of his decision to invade Iraq and his association with British and American arms companies. And many, many politicians have followed in those inglorious footsteps. The trade will supposedly increase growth in our economy, create jobs. Well, the overwhelming number of studies show that, in fact, it is the most expensive way to create jobs. For the investment by the public sector in each job in the defense sector, because these are the most heavily subsidized companies on the planet. For the similar public investment in each defense job, we could create between 3 and 7 equivalent jobs in more socially and economically productive sectors. And unfortunately, as I'll outline in a minute, it actually reduces rather than increases GDP. What the arms trade does, and it does remarkably efficiently, is it transfers public money, our taxes, into private profits. Profits in the form of dividends and bribes for the financial institutions who own defense companies today and the politicians who act as their puppets in our legislatures. Finally, and again, extremely important to understand this world that your government is so obsessed with climbing into, is that this trade in weapons, which is veiled behind a curtain of national security imposed secrecy, lives on its own legal planet, where impunity thrives. None of these people are ever investigated, let alone charged. Now, we've seen that not only with the corruption underpinning the industry, but also with what they do with the weaponry. You look at the state of Israel today, and the majority of its senior ministers in any society in which the rule of law was functional, in any society that had basic civilized standards, these people would have been in jail decades ago. Instead, they're senior ministers of a government that is overseeing the world's first live screen genocide. Now, I sadly experienced firsthand most of these aspects of this militarism and the trade in weapons. As a young member of parliament in our nascent democracy in South Africa, Nelson Mandela's successor, Thabo Mbeki, decided to spend $10 billion on weapons that we had absolutely no need of and that we've barely used until today. Why? Because almost $500 million in bribes were paid to my own political party, the ANC, to a number of senior politicians, officials, and military leaders. It was the point at which the democratic South Africa lost its moral compass. We were promised countless jobs, hundreds of thousands of new jobs, none of which materialized, literally none. We were promised that this investment would be the driving force of a new growing economy. In fact, over the first 18 years of that deal, it shaved on average 0.3% of GDP from our economy. But what was most tragic was the social opportunity cost. At the time that Mbeki embarked on this deal, he told the 6 million South Africans living with HIV or AIDS that we did not have the fiscal resources to provide them with the antiretroviral drugs they required to stay alive. As a consequence of that policy choice, over the next 5 years, according to a study by Harvard University, 365,000 South Africans died avoidable deaths. 32,000 babies every year for those 5 years and many years afterwards were born HIV positive because we couldn't afford mother-to-child transmission treatment, but we could afford to buy jet fighters from BAE and Finmeccanica, to buy frigates from German companies and helicopters from Italian companies. These people were too poor to be able to buy life, and the state that should have been keeping them alive was too busy corrupting itself. If you want to read about some of this research that I've mentioned in describing this industry, on my organization's website, you can read for free a book called Indefensible: 7 Myths That Sustain the Global Arms Trade. The website is at shadowworldinvestigations.org. But your government will tell you that as a part of joining this Western militarism, you will be able to grow Ireland's tech industry. You will become a part of a wave of extraordinary technological development. Well, let's look at that for a moment. What we in our new book, Making a Killing, describe as the defense tech industry. Companies like Palantir, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, who've been making billions that we will reveal in the book from the slaughter in Gaza and over 11 years in Yemen. These companies are run by some of the most egregious, appalling individuals I've ever researched and investigated in my life. Just 2 of them: Elon Musk, who I'm sure you've all heard of, and Peter Thiel, the founder of Palantir, the company to which Keir Starmer has been delightfully selling off the British state, for which I'm sure when he's kicked out of office in the next few months, he will be richly, richly rewarded. These 2 people both grew up in apartheid South Africa. Their grandparents actually immigrated into apartheid South Africa because it was as close as they could find to Nazi Germany post-World War II. And sadly, these 2 individuals learned exactly the wrong lesson from that experience of growing up under apartheid. They learned a sense of privilege, a sense of white supremacy, a racism that pervades almost every business idea that they have. They are truly terrifying people. And Ralph Ellison, who runs Oracle, all of these big tech billionaires are cut of the same cloth. What lies at the center of their foray into the defense world is terrifying technology, like the Where's Daddy software, that alerts members of the IOF when a father returns to the family home in Gaza or Lebanon. so that the IOF can then bomb the family home, killing every single inhabitant. They are responsible for the technology that is included in tiny drones that fly around Gaza, imitating the sounds of babies and children crying and in desperate need. Why? Because that is used to lure other children and parents out of their homes and into the open, where they can be more easily killed. And the CEOs of these companies, when interviewed, proudly embrace the fact that their companies enable this sort of murder. This is the psychotic world in which we live today, and which your government want you to become deeply embedded in. They want you to make the choice of, at all times, conflict over diplomacy and peace. But you have a choice. As Claire so eloquently said at the beginning of her address, history is made by ordinary people working collectively. And our governments in the United States, in the United Kingdom, across Europe, have become terrified of their citizens, which is why we have seen a new wave of authoritarianism and repression that has led to young activists engaged in direct action in the United Kingdom being sentenced to prison as terrorists for opposing a genocide by the very people who are the actual terrorists perpetrating and facilitating and profiting from a genocide. So this is the choice that Ireland faces. And in wishing you an incredibly productive weekend on such an important topic, and wishing Ireland a future of peace, progress, prosperity, and internationalism, let me end by reminding you that there is no country on this planet that has engaged in the global arms trade and the militarism that comes with it that has not experienced the undermining of its rule of law, both domestically and internationally, that has not been made more corrupt by the trade, less democratic, and perhaps most ironic of all, less safe by its involvement in the global trade in weapons. Thank you very much.